Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Nuts and Bolts of Writing. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Links in the description. Today, we'll be talking to Fortunate Games, who is currently working on Sam in New York, which is a multimedia project in the form of a visual novel and webtoon comic. Sam in New York tells the story of a young man trying to discover his purpose in life as he is torn between his strict parents' desire for him to be a lawyer and his own love of the stage. Today we'll be taking a look at Raisa Abramov, who is Sam, the protagonist's mother. So welcome, Fortunate Games. It's so great to have you again.
Thank you. I'm
Thank
very
you.
excited to talk more about Riza because I think she's been a long neglected character.
And we're so excited to hear about her because it's often these, long neglected characters or characters we may not think have significance that hold, some very fascinating and powerful facets to their character and their contribution.
Exactly.
Right. So, right out of the gate, can you give us a basic run through of Rise's story? Like, where was she born, and when, and how, and why did she go to America?
Sure. Okay, so Riza's full name is Raisa Rifkina. That was her original maiden name before she married Lev, and then she became Abramova. She was born in Odessa, Ukraine in 1873. As everyone should know already because of my posts on Instagram and elsewhere, she is the protagonist Sam's mother. She is less strict than her husband, Lev, but she can be quite demanding at times, although generally speaking, she is much more understanding of Sam than Lev usually is. Growing up, Riza was the youngest of her parents' 5 children, and as such, was kind of babied throughout her formative years. Her family was originally from Slutsk in Belarus, making her a family of Litvak origin, just like Lev's. As a quick note, Litvak is the Yiddish term for a Jew of historical or greater Lithuania. The Litvaks' territory of origin is significantly larger than the borders of independent Lithuania today, or Lithuania Republic of the interwar period from 1918 to 1940. Right now, so from a Jewish cultural and historical perspective, Lithuania includes large swaths of northeastern Poland, particularly the Bialystok and Suwalki regions, northern and western Belarus, notably the Grodno, Minsk, Slutsk, Pinsk, Brisk, Shklov, Mogilev, Gomel, and Vitebsk regions, southern Latvia, notably the Dvinsk region, and northeastern Prussia, notably the region of the Baltic Port Sea of Memel. This expensive definition of Lithuania in Jewish historiography and culture corresponds roughly to the large territory under the jurisdiction of the Lithuanian Jewish Council, which governed Lithuanian Jewish communal affairs from 1623 to 1764. So that's just a brief run through of what a Litvak is. And generally, in the early 20th century and the 19th century, there was a large divide between the Litvak Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe and the Galicianer Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe. So there are other characters in Sam in New York who are not Litvak. For example, Harvey, the guy who runs Feingold's, he is a Galicianer. So he has some cultural habits that are slightly different from Sam's parents, who grew up Litvak, but they did grow up in a region that was not really traditionally Litvak, which was Odessa. So they did have a lot of exposure to other groups. Galicianers are usually more outgoing, more friendly, like as the stereotype goes, right? Because I mean, each person's different, but the stereotype was that Galicianers were more warm, not as intellectual, not as demanding, and basically they were like really funny people and basically liked to eat sweet food. While the Litvaks were more serious, they were more intellectual, and sometimes they were kind of seen as people who were just way too obsessed with logic and not like emotions. So basically, yes, both Lev and Riza were originally from Litvak families. Riza's father was a Yiddish poet, and he was involved in the Yiddishist movement, just like Lev. and this Yiddishist movement sought to promote Yiddish literature and art. Raisa met Lev at the Yiddish theater and was thoroughly impressed by his convictions and intense personality. Generally speaking, Raisa is a sensitive person who always thinks of the worst possible outcome. As such, she can be quite worried all the time. After marrying Lev, she and Lev decided to immigrate to America due to the pogroms rocking Ukraine in the 1890s. Lev and Raisa settle on the Lower East Side and become newspaper editors and writers for a number of Yiddish newspapers, and also work as printers, basically, printing pamphlets and signs for a number of small businesses with their small business Abramov's printers. In the USA, Raisa also chooses to be known as Raisa Abramov to avoid confusion, since Abramova is the feminine version of Abramov, and there are no gendered last names in America.
So this is a very fascinating, outlook of Raisa's life and the background, and sort of the legacy that she is stemming from, and also carrying on in her own way. Not only by helping Lev, run the business, but also, carrying this. And I think also too, we'll be exploring, later throughout this interview, some of what, how do I say, like Rise's personal interests and ambitions are.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think another question I think a lot of people would have, how did Lev and Risa meet, and what did she think of him when they first met? How did they get closer? And probably what a lot of people were probably wondering too, were they romantic in the traditional sense, or was it more of a logical meeting of minds?
Okay, this might surprise you or it might not surprise you, but I will go on. And let's see how you react and everyone else thinks about it. I think there will be some surprises. So, as I said previously, Raisa meets Lev when they're both at the Yiddish theater in 1894 or so. Lev was 24 and Raisa was around 21. She was working in her watchmaker father's shop at the time, and Lev was working as a newspaper editor at the time. It so happened that she kept on bumping into Lev every time she went there. The reason? He was there to meet some other people in the left-wing movements that he was involved with, and many of these people also happened to be at the Yiddish theater. Raisa started getting more curious about this man who she keeps on bumping into, and eventually finds out from her friends that he was kind of a big figure in left-wing socialist movements, which sought to unite all Jewish workers in the Russian Empire and also sought to ally itself with the wider Russian social democratic movement to achieve a democratic and socialist Russia. The movements were very progressive with regards to gender, and women made up at least 1/3 of most of them. Some of Raisa's female friends were also involved in these movements, and some of them knew Lev himself. Eventually, Raisa worked up the courage to talk to Lev, since she thought, and her friends as well, that he was rather attractive and that he rather stuck out from the rest of the crowd because he had such firm convictions and he had such an intense personality. Lev liked how Raisa was a very open person and how she asked him about things that he usually didn't care about too much, such as music, food, and poetry. Lev usually was just too focused on politics and all of these quote-unquote serious things that he didn't really have time to think about other things anymore. He has a one-track mind, and sometimes he just becomes so obsessed with one thing, which is another thing he has in common with Sam, by the way, because Sam is obsessed with theater, while Lev is obsessed with politics and being right, that he doesn't really have time for anything else. Lev was actually also never really into literature, but due to Rice's influence, he started reading more of literature. Previously, he had dismissed reading fiction, literature, and poetry as unimportant because he prefers, as he says, to focus on the real world, as he calls it. So Lev and Raisa actually started really liking each other a lot. They got along pretty well, despite their differences and in spite of their differences, and Lev eventually found himself opening up to Raisa. He's not a very emotional person, but then I think talking more to Raisa made him realize that he has another side to him. He appreciated Rise's emotional candor and came to appreciate the fact that she wasn't as political as he was, because he did appreciate being able to take a break from politics and being political. She agreed with many of his principles, but she was nowhere as vocal as he was, or as stubborn as he is. Lev and Risa were thus quite in love with each other, so they decided to get married quite quickly, maybe within a year or two of getting to know each other. In 1896, they got married. It was a big event. Risa invited all of her family and friends, and Lev invited all of the family members he had who were in Odessa or close to Odessa. Unfortunately, his own parents were too far away because they were all the way in Minsk, and at that point, he was no longer in touch with them because he was so different from how they were raised. He became extremely left-wing, atheist, and totally non-traditional, while they stuck to the traditional way of life. So, I guess Lev kind of felt like he had to cut himself away from them because he's not really sure how to talk to them and whether they would approve of his actions. So basically, Risa and Lev, after Sam is born, they always talk to him about their wedding. And in Sam's naive young eyes, he always imagines his parents' wedding as a huge event with nearly all of Odessa celebrating.
Oh, God bless. Oh, that is so sweet and very touching. Oh my. That is lovely. And not only is it realistic, but I think it shows a happy healthiness to it, and I think that's a nice balance to see, particularly, in narratives, because I think so many narratives that have the focus, particularly today, are very negative, focus on the toxic, and especially like in mainstream Western media, all we get is marriage stories. So, um, but so this is remarkable, and it makes sense, how they would form this dynamic, and it's a very, subtle, nuanced dynamic, but it works very well, and it really secures the bond between these two.
Thank you so much. Because, I did come up with it very recently only. So I didn't really think about it a lot of times before I finalized it. So I'm glad that you think it sounds realistic. Because I
It
was thinking
does.
about how to show it in the form of the comic. Because I think in chapter 2, I think maybe Sam will have some, well, not flashbacks, but basically it's just like from his viewpoint, what he thinks his parents were like in Odessa.
Oh my gosh, I can't wait to see that, and I know the audience can't wait to see that either, because sometimes it's nice to see what someone else thinks of you. It brings their own flavor, if you will, their own
Mm-hmm.
cinematic storytelling flavor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I guess another thing to ask is, so as we discussed before with Lev, in the previous interview, um, immigrating, and other episodes we've done, immigrating has a big impact on people. It has a significant way of altering them, for better or worse, or at least altering the way they do things or the way they think. It's like being transported to like an alien world in many ways. So how would you think, for someone like Riza, did her personality change when she immigrated to America? And how would you compare that to what she had been prior to immigrating to America?
Very good question. I would say that there was definitely a big change. Before immigrating to America, Riza was open, optimistic, friendly in her own somewhat quiet way, and she had many friends and often went to cafes. She was a bit sheltered since she was the youngest of her siblings and her parents doted on her. After immigrating to America, due to economic pressures and social isolation, since due to work, Riza only often socializes with Sam, Lev, and only a handful of friends outside of the family, she becomes increasingly paranoid, isolated, depressed, and emotionally erratic. She starts thinking the worst when things happen and tends to distrust and mistrust strangers. She becomes obsessed with regulating every aspect of Sam's life to make sure he's safe and won't get, quote unquote, corrupted by bad friends with bad values. She and Lev become more and more serious and demanding and become obsessed with work and regulating Sam's life. Other than that, Lev and Riza have very little time for anything else. So basically, immigration does change her personality. And I would say that Riza becomes someone that her younger self probably wouldn't really recognize.
Yeah, that's very, I mean, that is very, how do I say, not shattering, but like it's something that it holds a lot of gravity. It holds a lot of weight because that does happen. I mean, with the circumstances that usually ensue when one immigrates to a new country, especially with economic and social issues that arise. It's no wonder she undergoes this alteration. It's like it's kind of molds her into it and influences her. And it's somewhat sad to see, because I mean I think that's kind of the narrative of so many immigrants that anywhere they go that this happens. And it's really sad to see this because we definitely see a very vibrant, vivacious spirit in the younger Riza that is unfortunately extinguished, by the economic and social pressures that she was sort of molded into by immigrating.
Hmm.
What do you think? Are there any positive aspects to her, immigration experience? Like, are there things that, how do I say, like any little like any traits of her personality that might have improved, or any character growth that some people undergo as they get older?
I think she is a little less delicate, but at the same time, she becomes a lot more paranoid. So it's hard to say, but I would say in average, she becomes a little bit tougher because she withstands a lot of pressure and basically becomes more independent because she doesn't have a large family or a group of friends to fall back on, which she did have in Odessa. But in America, it's just her, Sam, and Lev, basically.
Right, right. So there is sort of a positive aspect to it, although it does come at a heavy price.
Hmm. And I think so many aspects of her personality changes, especially the whole paranoia thing. She wasn't that paranoid in Odessa. Like she was always kind of scared of things, but in America, because of the social isolation, it just becomes a lot worse, I think.
Right, it just heightens it to the nth degree.
Especially with Sam, because she's so afraid of him not being successful and like, getting in trouble and stuff like that. So because he's her son, she becomes way more anxious. I think if she didn't have any children in America, she might not be that anxious, but because of Sam, she becomes really anxious.
Right, right. That makes sense. It really does make sense. And I think that's, part of an experience, I think, for people who immigrate, who happen to be, mothers, and they have children, here, or anywhere they have it in the country they immigrated to. There is going to be that paranoia over their child, because it's so uncertain, even if it is a supposedly stable place. I think that's a fear many, mothers who immigrate face.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I guess another thing to ask, well, speaking of Sam, and how she, her paranoia and things, how does she change after Sam is born? Like how would you say, did it evolve, or was it sort of a static development?
Oh, she definitely evolved. I would say that after Sam is born, she becomes much more paranoid, much more protective. And I would say that she takes more initiative to do things because she wants to protect her son from, you know, failing in society and just going through a lot of bad things. She wants to protect him from all of that. So sometimes she takes on a lot of pressure and basically wants to shield him a lot from that pressure. So, starting from when Sam is around 6 or 7, Lev starts to face a lot of economic problems due to his business, his printing press. And Riza becomes increasingly nervous. And when Sam is asleep, or they think he's asleep, she gets into a lot of heated discussions with Lev about finances that sometimes erupt into barely suppressed arguments. Although Riza tries to keep this away from Sam, Sam can overhear their discussions and how worried they are about the future and himself. Lev and Riza's relationship becomes increasingly pragmatic, and they are focused primarily on making ends meet, so much that they barely feel affectionate towards each other anymore, since they're so focused on survival. Sam can sense this, and at this time, this is when Lev also starts becoming stricter towards Sam. since he wants Sam to succeed at any cost and becoming a professional, so he doesn't have to go through the same struggles that he and Raisa are currently going through as immigrants whose credentials aren't recognized in America. So they had to start a small business, which was very risky.
Right, right. And this makes sense. I mean, and it is admirable how she does try to shield Sam from some of this, although, I think when we look back in hindsight, which is always 2020, sometimes it's good if parents open to the problems, to their children. I think that's always the healthiest thing to do. But on the other flip coin, I can see why many parents choose not to. They don't want to put that burden on their children. So this is very interesting, how that altered her. And then of course, the sort of gradual erosion of affection, with Lev as things got harder for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So do you think with Lev and Risa's relationship, like with Risa herself, does she ever think that they could, reclaim what they once had in terms of, affection in the marriage? Or does she feel like that's sort of a lost cause and they're just going to pretty much, just wither into, pragmatic oblivion, so to speak?
I think she thinks it can be reclaimed, but it comes much later. And by that time, who knows what will happen because people keep on changing, right? She and Lev
Right.
will become different as they get older. And she thinks that they can only recover what they've lost if Sam gets a good job, because she thinks this is really about economic stability, right? Because one of the reasons why this all fell apart was because of the lack of economic stability. So this is also why she doesn't want Sam to become an actor, because she thinks that he couldn't make enough to support himself or them as an actor. And then she thinks that, if he also just continues living in poverty like they are, what's going to happen? They're all going to become more miserable. All three of
Right.
them.
My goodness. So this definitely puts a lot more pressure on Sam, who now only he has to, pretty much shoulder this Atlas-like burden of not only his own prosperity and happiness, but his own parents too. They're pinning it all on him, which I think many parents unfortunately do that with their children.
Oh, they do, especially since Sam is an only child, right?
Yes, that does happen. It does happen. It's not like Sam had an older brother who was like more pragmatic and a copy of Lev, and like Lev's like, yes, my oldest son, and then I don't know, you get into like I don't know, Jacob Isaac. I mean, with Esau and Isaac type of thing. No, Esau and Jacob, getting them confused, and all those years of Sunday school didn't help me. Um, so, so I think so. This question is kind of reiterating, but just to explore further. So as Sam grows older, and whatever Sam's fate may be, does her relationship with Lev and Sam change, or does it remain static?
I think that it always changes. There's always going to be some kind of event that changes either one of them, and that means their relationship changes.
Right, right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Well, would you say that besides being protective and paranoid and sort of pinning all the economic and social and emotional happiness on Sam, um, uh, does she feel like very affectionate mother? Like, is she this sort of I guess to essentially put it, the sort of mother that makes you soup when you're sick?
I think she is affectionate, but she's unfortunately not a good cook. So this is why they keep on going to find golds. And
Well,
well, Riza keeps on saying that their food's not good, it's not healthy, so you should eat my food instead. But she also puts very little effort into cooking. So it's like, what do we choose? Either we eat Riza's stuff, which is like from the supermarket and just like taken out and like putting water in it or something. It's very
right,
bland
right.
and very low effort, or fine golds, which is, as Frankie says, a 1 out of 5, but at least it tastes better, right? At least it's okay. It's not healthy. It's definitely not healthy. It's greasy, and it's sometimes too sweet or too savory, but at least it tastes like something, right? And
Yeah, that's
Lev can't cook. Once he
okay.
he tried to make borscht, but then he just threw in like whole tomatoes.
Oh my gosh. Or like whole beets too on
Yeah,
top of it.
and he's like, "What's the problem? Like, that's what it's made out
Drop it.
of. Why do we have to chop it? It's a waste of
Just
time."
drop it.
Yeah,
Do like that salt meme, you know.
yeah.
um, but yeah, I now I'm trying to imagine Sam cooking, and then he sets the place on fire like a Sims simulator.
Oh, he can't cook either. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, this. No wonder Frankie's worried about Sam. Like, if they had smartphones back in the 20s, he'd probably be texting him, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Like, are you eating? Are you still alive, Sam?"
And this is why Sam always goes to Feingold's. I mean, this is the place he kind of grew up in. That's his kitchen. He barely goes to his own kitchen.
No wonder, no wonder. God bless Harvey. Well, Harvey, you fed and sustained our boy, so props to you. Props to you, you cool man.
Hey, and not all of his food is as bad as Frankie claims it is, okay? Some of it is
Yeah,
actually good. It's just,
just Frankie's
unfortunately,
too much of
every
a
time
foodie.
Frankie goes there, he tries out the food that's not to his taste for some weird
Right.
reason.
Yeah, it's sort of like when you take your purse. It's like if you go to a food truck and you accidentally order the weirdest stuff. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is kind of interesting. So how would you say so so Riza does have a limited social life, but does she like to have celebrations like little parties to celebrate a milestone or a success? We do know that the family does celebrate New Year's because I mean everybody celebrates New Year's. Um, so I mean, how does she do that? I mean, does she think of herself as the hostess of the house, or is she too practical for that?
That's a good question. I think she would have to be the hostess because I don't think Lev is interested in these kind of parties unless they have some kind of political meaning or like
Mm.
some labor thing. Or
Let's unite.
he's trying to get to know someone who will, benefit his business, so he'll do that. But like just for the sake of it, probably not.
Probably, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, I mean, how would well now I'm worried because now I'm thinking of her attempting to cook for other people at a dinner party and
Oh, she
you
doesn't
know,
cook. She orders from Harvey's.
okay, that's a relief. Thank goodness. Phew.
She's too
That's a
tired to cook anyways. I mean, there's a practicality to it too. I mean,
yeah,
cooking for so many people takes time, and she doesn't want to,
it does.
cook something that people won't like because that will end up hurting her own feelings as well as other people's. So she's like, okay, just let's just
It's a
choose something
business.
that, someone else made. I mean, then no one will be offended.
No one will be offended. That makes sense. So speaking of things like holidays and like how do I say, the little things of life that make it special. Does she have any hobbies? Like, does she like any kind of crafting or, like card playing or like a special skill that she has that she enjoys in employing in something?
Special skill. I would say that she kind of enjoys maybe calligraphy because, her father was a part-time poet. Like he wasn't famous or anything, but it was his
Mm.
hobby. So she enjoys reading poetry and maybe like looking at literature and stuff like that. But no, she's not a writer herself. But I would say that her keen eye for characterization and words really rubbed off on Sam. So this is why he enjoys the literary aspects of theater. He doesn't only enjoy the performative aspects but also the literary aspects. He looks at story structure, character development, and how how all of these things kind of reflects human nature.
Right, right. And that makes sense. I mean, and it's nice to see how this kind of sparked, if you will, sort of an embryo in Sam's, imagination and, gave him that drive, for that appreciation for, like you said, not only the performative aspect of theater, but the literary aspect as well.
Hmm. So Sam is someone who appreciates literary things. It's just that he doesn't really read a lot because he doesn't have the patience to sit down and read it. So this is why he likes theater, because you don't have to sit down and you can talk to people while you're watching theater. So he finds it more interactive and more to what he likes the best. But basically, he does have some literary qualities to him. Like he's not an airhead, like in the sense, how the dean would think he is. He would be like, Sam, I can't believe you actually like this thing. You're just pretending, right? Because I don't think you actually appreciate literature.
Oh, for heaven's sakes, Dean. But but yeah, so this is very interesting. So do you feel like is there anything like any kind of activity or any particular thing that Riza enjoys doing with Sam? And maybe it's something that, is timeless, like, they did as a kid, but then they can do it as he grows up and as they both get older, like reading or something. I mean, or just discussing. I mean, it just depends, because there are some activities some people can share, with their parents, and it's like a timeless kind of thing.
Yiddish theater.
That's a great answer.
Mm-hmm.
That is so awesome. I think that's so sweet too. I love it.
Mm-hmm. Because that's how she met Lev, remember?
Right, right. So it's like, oh, like, praise be the theater, it's done so much for people.
So this is why she, even though she thinks it's impractical, she's a little bit more okay than Lev with Sam becoming a theater actor because she does realize its role in people's lives. But Lev is just like, no, you can't do it.
Yeah, it's wonderful that she has a more open mind, yet at the same time it's sad that Lev is so vehemently opposed to it. Well, I think if he wasn't so opposed to it, I think Riza would just like, go in full swing and, wave banners for her son.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is always that tension because Lev is so hard-headed about Sam having to become a lawyer.
Right, right. And so how does she feel about Sam becoming a lawyer? Does she feel like, boy's really got it in him, he can do it? Or in the back of her mind, does she think, this isn't the right path for my son? I know he really wants theater, and I think if things were better, he could really succeed at it.
I think it's definitely the latter. Liza also tries to push Sam to become a lawyer because she thinks that it's more practical. But as she looks deeper into it, and this is something that Lev doesn't want to look at because he's willfully blind to reality sometimes, Riza looks into it and talks to people and finds out that it's really hard to be a lawyer because, Sam's quote unquote ethnic. He has an ethnic last name. People who are lawyers during that time period usually belong to the wealthy WASP, or they call it the old boys club, right? In America,
Exactly. Yeah, the old
old
boy.
boys WASP club, right? So like all of these like
Yeah.
rich connected people who went to private schools and they were in America for over 100 years. Sam's not part of that. I mean, when they look at his last name, they just throw away his resume. They know he's not one of them. He didn't go to
Right.
one of their swanky private law schools. He didn't go. Well, I mean, he went to the law school, but he didn't go to their high school, which is where most of these people met. And right, and like even though he went to the law school, he tried to befriend those people, but it was hard because they came from a totally different society and they already had all their friend groups already. So like they're always meeting at these golf tournaments and golf clubs, and he doesn't even know how to get into them.
Right, right. That makes sense. So so essentially, Riza does see the reality and it frightens her, and that's probably why she kind of joins in Lev, with the megaphone for the lawyer biz.
Yeah, and also she doesn't want Sam to give up just yet. She knows it's going to be harder for him because he can't fit into the WASP society. But then at the same time, she's like, you're already in law school. You got the scholarship to go there. So why not at least finish your degree?
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. So she has a very, practical approach that, kind of, you know what I mean? It just illustrates the whole practicality of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but she knows that there are going to be difficulties. While Lev, he thinks that if Sam doesn't end up becoming a lawyer, it's just because he's lazy.
Yeah. But yeah, I always think like a good sound mother always knows, the inner workings of their children.
Mm-hmm.
I might be biased because, I my mother sees through me like a Ziploc bag, but but I think, a lot of other people can relate to that. So I guess some other small things to go into, which, are sort of interesting tidbits to explore. So what are some of the things that she truly enjoys about Yiddish theater besides its literary approach, its thematic approach? Like, does she think much about the aesthetic of it, or is she not really a person that is like influenced or, considers the aesthetic
I think she's mostly influenced by the themes.
by the
You have to
themes?
remember, like, as an immigrant kind of play, how it was like Yiddish theater when it moved to America was mostly an immigrant thing, right? So most people were not extremely wealthy, so they didn't have a lot of money for costumes or to make it look really pretty. So it was mostly about the content rather than the beautiful costumes or anything like that.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So it's about the soul, not the glitz.
Exactly. I think a lot of people couldn't have afforded it. I mean, the tickets were not that expensive, because if they were, then I mean, people would probably not be able to get in because they have to pay other expenses too. And it's just
Right, right.
entertainment. And if the actors and actresses were all wearing really beautiful clothes and the scenery was amazing, then the price of the tickets would increase.
Yes, yes, it would. So essentially, it's very necessary to, think about the content, rather than the how do I say, than the display of it all.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
Exactly. So I
right.
think what she really enjoys about Yiddish theater is all the variety of themes that it covers. There's a lot of things in it that are really relatable to people, especially, immigrants like them. A lot of the stories adapted for the American Yiddish theater were about immigrants specifically. And, I think that's something Riza could really relate to. And she can think about her own life and, how to improve certain aspects of her own life, even though she kind of feels like it's really hard. But it kind of feels like going to the psychiatrist in a way. And I think Riza is too proud to go to a psychiatrist. So she kind of goes to these sessions as a way to kind of relieve her own tension.
That makes sense. I think a lot of people can find therapy through, performative art, or, a story that is, written out in a performative manner. I mean, that's why they say a lot of things like writing therapy or play therapy are put
Mm-hmm.
into use by modern psychiatry.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's how she thinks of Yiddish theater. And this is why I think Sam is also attracted to Yiddish theater, because he thinks of it as a way of understanding the human condition.
Right, right. And that makes sense. It makes sense because, the Abramovs are a remarkable family that ponder very much on that single question, the human condition, logic, and improvement.
Mm-hmm. I wrote this
Right.
blurb for, for if Sam's novel was an actual novel that got published. And I think
Okay.
this is actually a really good explanation of why Sam likes the theater. So this is the
Okay.
blurb for if
Read.
this is for if Sam in New York was actually a book. So thrust through life by his unceasing love for the theater and obsession with fame, law school dropout Sam Abramov has made it his life's mission to take America by storm. The only child of demanding parents, Sam seeks fame as a writer, actor, and filmmaker, not only for its own sake, but to also quench his undying curiosity about human nature. Deeply introspective and boldly honest, Sam in New York paints an intimate picture of Sam's formative years growing up in 1920s New York City.
That is a fantastic blurb. I mean, this is absolutely fantastic. I mean, this is something that, I mean, this would instantly arrest people. And it's an most accurate summation of what Sam and his story is all about and what it encompasses.
Mm-hmm. Essentially, it's about not only Sam discovering his own place in society and what he's called to do, like as in career, but also his own role in his family as he grows up, and basically what kind of person he wants to be in all aspects of his life, not just whether he wants to be a lawyer or an actor, but what kind of lover he wants to be, what kind of son he wants to be to his parents, what kind of student he wants to be if he continues to be a student, what kind of filmmaker he wants to be, what kind of actor he wants to be.
Right, right. So I mean, this is definitely the full capacity of one being, a human being in life, essentially. So many of the questions, so many of the facets of thinking. I mean, there's so many facets to it. I mean, this is so fascinating, this whole journey that we are going on with Sam. There's so much more to explore too.
Mm-hmm, definitely. I think Sam in New York is like basically like an onion. You peel back one layer and there's like 1,000 more looking back at you.
Yes, exactly, exactly. There is so much. I mean, this is something that I think is inexhaustible, and I don't think anybody could get weary of it because there's so much to explore
I
each time
hope
you peel
not.
back.
I hope there's people won't get weary of it because I think a lot of these layers will have to be explored not only in the graphic novel, but also in, an anthology of short stories that, I'm working on and in crossovers that I'm working on with you and, in the visual novel eventually. But I think the visual novel will come later because there's so much work in it, There's so many things I have to develop before I do the visual novel because the visual
Right,
novel is basically encompassing a lot of the things that I haven't even started on yet.
right, right. That makes sense. That makes sense. So I mean, this is why it's a multimedia project. There's so many things you can fit Sam into.
Oh
And
yeah. Mm-hmm.
exactly, exactly. I mean, make a film, make a screenplay, make a play, make a novel, like traditional novel, make a visual novel, um, make like a professional graphic novel, webtoon comic, anything. There's so much that individual role plays that could be translated as improvised screenplays.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. There's so
Oh my,
many layers to uncover. I'm just so glad that, you know, this year I've really been able to work more on Sam in New York and flesh it out more. Because last year and the year before, when I started thinking more about Sam in New York, I would think that it was kind of more shallow, it was not as deep as it is now. And basically, there's just so many things to uncover that I haven't even started yet. And I wouldn't have ever thought that it would have gotten so deep because previously it was just a simple story about a guy having to choose between his passion for the theater and what his parents want for him. I would have never expected this to become so complex.
it's amazing how these things evolve, and I think that's a wonderful testimony to the potential that um, exponentially expands and grows as a creator has less and less fears and reservations about their own work and their character. And I think that this could also inspire and encourage other creators to take a similar path of exploration with their own work and characters.
I hope so. Do you think Sam's growth as a character kind of parallels your own character Andre's growth?
I think to some degree, yes. I mean, in terms of the potential for exploration, I think the process was somewhat different. I feel like Andre is not so much a character to develop, but a person who wants me to narrate his story. The only challenge is trying to uncover everything he has to tell and explore more of that, and then the people around him as well. Because I'm just seeing everything through his lens, so it can be kind of difficult at times.
Mm-hmm. That
But
makes
I
sense.
would I would say it's similar though, because I mean, like I said, Andre's novel is probably going to end up being a 400-page tome, like a heavy thing you use as a paperweight.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be other stuff. There might be other things that come out of it. I don't know yet. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I suppose the last thing, what advice, like just for parting words, what advice would you wish to impart to creators who maybe feel like they're stuck on certain aspects, or they feel like they can't find that many layers to uncover in their story and they're worried, oh, my story's going to be short or shallow? What advice would you give to them, for exploring further and deeper paths into their work and characters?
I would say take a free form approach. So think about things in your own life that you want to explore more. What kind of things are happening in your own life that you feel like isn't usually explored in fiction? Can you do it? Do you think you want to do it? Like just tease out those themes and think about how they could apply to your story.
That's wonderful advice. And I hope that many creators will, take that to heart and apply that if they are struggling with the aforementioned struggles that we've just mentioned. Um, so I guess another conclusion. So, do we expect to see more of Rise's development as Sam's story and the various media projects evolve?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I'm already going to be putting more of Riza in chapter 1 and 2 because her development and Lev's is actually very important to how Sam's character develops when he's a child.
Wonderful, and it's so wonderful to see how, integral she was to that development.
She's a very important character. I mean, for the first few chapters of Sam in New York, I would say Sam, Lev, and Riza are very important. The other characters don't become important until much later.
So much later. Well, I guess one final question. How does Sam view his mother? Like, does he, like, how do I say, is he very affectionate with his mother? Or, does he feel sometimes there's a distance and, you know, he sometimes keeps his own distance, because of that distance?
I think he's very affectionate towards her, but that usually comes when he's older. Like when he's younger, he wants to keep his distance a little bit because he feels like she's too paranoid and she often pushes him to do things that he doesn't want to, like the piano thing, because she and Lev thought it would make him smarter. So if he was always with her and always being affectionate towards her, she would probably keep on trying to push him to play the piano. So he would probably withdraw into himself for a little while when she becomes a bit forceful. I think when she's
Right.
older and he's older, like he's in university, he feels more freedom to be nicer to her and more affectionate because then she doesn't feel like she can force him into anything because he's too old for that.
Right. It's kind of like in a position to bargain, so to speak.
Hmm.
Essentially, yeah. So this was a very, very fascinating look into Rise's character, her life, her development, the legacy she stemmed from, the legacy that she may not realize that she's imparting through her own passions, onto Sam, and the significance of that influence. And this is wonderful that we got to explore this tonight. Because too often people in positions like Riza are too often ignored, or the significance of their influence is not recognized. So it was wonderful to explore this tonight.
Thank you so much for these wonderful questions.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. I mean, it was a delight and honor to do it. And is there anything you'd like to depart I mean impart to our readers before we conclude the interview?
Next week, we will probably learn more about the Yiddish theater.
Fantastic. That sounds fascinating, and we certainly can't wait to delve into that.
Mm-hmm. All right, see you.
See you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.